This movie is based on real events that took place in Massachusetts in 1980. In the opening scenes, we see the site of a gruesome crime. Next, events take us some time into the future. A guy named Kenny Waters is in prison. His sister Betty visits him regularly. The girl is a university student at the Faculty of Law. Family photos hang on the walls of her room. In her spare time, Betty works on her brother's case. She raises 2 sons and works in a bar at night. Abra Rice approached Betty. They are studying together. Since they are the only adults in the class, Abra suggested that they become friends. Betty doesn't have time for friends, but Abra was very persistent. After some hesitation, Betty told Abra that her brother Kenny had become a victim of a miscarriage of justice and was sentenced to life in prison. He has been behind bars for 12 years already. Betty believes her brother is innocent and is determined to do everything to get him out. When Abra asked what Kenny was accused of, Betty remembered that fateful day. The police arrived at the crime scene, after which Officer Nancy Taylor drove to Kenny's house. The guy's been in trouble with the law before, and Officer Taylor didn't hide her animosity toward him. She insistently told Kenny to come with her. Kenny refused, not understanding what was happening. Then the officer pulled out her gun. Kenny had no choice but to comply. When Betty found out, she immediately went to the police station and demanded an explanation. Someone took Mrs. Brow's life last night. Since Kenny was already in trouble with the law, he automatically became a suspect. Kenny was released on his own recognizance. Of course, he didn't take the situation seriously. Betty and Kenny were always very close. In their childhood, they constantly got into mischief, drawing the attention of the police. But their parents didn't care. In Kenny's youth, he already had a wife Brenda and a daughter Mandy. Despite the frivolity, Kenny was a very loving father. Betty also has a boyfriend with whom she is planning a family. That night at the bar, Kenny got into a fight, as often happens. Betty had to intervene. She is very worried about her brother and doesn't want him to get into trouble. However, Kenny doesn't take life seriously, only thinking about entertainment and drinking. Soon Betty got married and had a son. She is most afraid of becoming like her mother. In the middle of the night, the phone rang. That's how Betty learned of her father's passing. A funeral was held, which was interrupted by the police, arresting Kenny right in the church. Betty tried to stop it, but the case was serious. 2 years after Mrs. Brow's demise, Kenny was officially charged. Betty visited her brother in the detention center at the first opportunity. Kenny is sure that there is no reason to worry. He is innocent, and the police will soon prove it. Betty wants to believe in the best. After some time, the trial took place. Brenda testified against her husband, describing him as an impulsive person capable of inappropriate actions. Kenny doesn't understand why his wife is doing this. She also confirmed that the instrument of crime belonged to Kenny. The guy has an alibi, but the court didn't find it convincing enough. All physical evidence was considered. Another witness, Rosanna Perry, Kenny's ex-girlfriend, claimed that he had bragged about the crime. Betty and Kenny's mother was also called as a witness. She had 9 children, whom she had never taken care of. Furthermore, the woman was deprived of her maternal rights. All her children were left to fend for themselves. Once, Kenny and Betty broke into the house of their neighbor Mrs. Brow. The woman called the police. This was not the first time it had happened. During a break, their mother told Betty that she was not to blame for anything. The woman allegedly worked a lot, so she didn't have time for the children. When the woman mentioned that she had always been afraid that Kenny would harm someone, Betty became furious and told her mother not to dare say that again. In the past, the police had decided to take Kenny and Betty out of the family and send them to different orphanages. The brother and sister didn't want to be separated, so they hid. In the end, they were caught by the police again. When Kenny was taken away, Betty cried, begging the officers not to separate them. The judge was ready to deliver a verdict. Kenny was found guilty. Betty couldn't hold back her tears, while Kenny was in a detached state. As her brother was being led away, Betty shouted that she would do everything possible to get him out. Betty's husband said that he was very sorry, but there was nothing that could be changed now. In prison, Kenny was trying to get the right to call and behaved rowdy. Meanwhile, Betty also tried to contact her brother, who had disappeared after the failed appeal. The husband asks Betty to accept the fact that her brother won't be released for the rest of his life. But Betty will never accept that. Finally, the lawyer called back and informed Betty that Kenny was in solitary confinement. He had tried to voluntarily pass away. Betty still managed to arrange a meeting with her brother. Kenny was desperate, knowing that it was all over for him. No one but the sister believed in his innocence. But Betty was not giving up. She was willing to take out a loan and hire the best lawyer just to get her brother out of there. Before Kenny was taken away, Betty asked him to promise that he wouldn't give up. In the car, Betty cried helplessly. She didn't know how to help the most important person in her life. Learning that Betty had decided to get a law degree, her husband was not thrilled. He understood that his wife only wanted to go to law school for her brother's sake and asked her to stop. During their next meeting, Betty shared her plans with Kenny. Getting a law degree would take a lot of time, but it was their only hope. Betty wanted to uncover the truth and prove her brother's innocence. Betty immersed herself in the studies. Abra was impressed by her determination. Betty's sons were upset that their mother didn't spend much time with them. Kenny's case had become the purpose of her life, and nothing else mattered. During their next meeting, the brother and sister discussed how to pursue a retrial. At one point, Betty admitted that she was on the verge of being expelled. She was doing well academically, but she had recently missed a presentation and failed an exam. However, Betty assured her brother that she had everything under control. Kenny didn't want his sister to cry. She was the only person who hadn't turned away from him. Later, Betty picked up her sons, who had spent the weekend with their father. On the way, the boys said they had decided to live with the father. They needed a parent's attention, but their mother was always busy. Betty didn't object. Now she would only spend weekends with the sons. Left alone, Betty gave in to her emotions. Abra became worried when Betty started skipping classes. Betty fell into depression, feeling worthless like her mother. Abra wanted to help the friend and encouraged her to attend at least one seminar. It would be the first step towards breaking free from melancholy. Finally, Betty found the strength to get out of bed. As she reread letters from her brother, she couldn't hold back a smile. The next day, Betty attended her classes. She had a lot of absences, but she planned to make up for it. A classmate mentioned a case where a person spent 10 years in prison due to a mistake until DNA analysis proved his innocence. Abra found an article about new crime investigation methods that could lead to exoneration. Betty instantly became interested. For the first time in years there was a glimmer of hope. Betty spent hours with her books, studying scientific literature. She also read articles online and even stayed in the library at night. The next day, Betty went to Abra, saying that DNA analysis was her key. There was a lot of genetic material found at the crime scene, but DNA testing was not available back then. Abra's husband, Don, was skeptical about this endeavor, but Betty would not back down for anything. She immediately emailed the renowned lawyer Barry Scheck, hoping that he would take up the case. 16 years had passed since Kenny was convicted. Betty had done everything in her power, but it hadn't helped. Now her only hope was Barry Scheck and his Innocence Project. Soon the law firm replied to Betty's email, asking her to obtain DNA samples. They had a long queue of cases to review, so it would be at least a year and a half before they could take on Kenny's case. It's exam day at the university. If Betty passed it, she could become Kenny's attorney and independently obtain the physical evidence. She received the exam results by mail. Betty was very nervous and didn't immediately open the envelope, but she was relieved to know that she had passed the exam. When Betty told her brother about DNA analysis and her law degree, he was overjoyed. Kenny was truly proud of his sister. Their journey would be tough, but together they would overcome it. Without wasting time, Betty called the police, and introducing herself as Abra Rice, requested the evidence from the 1983 case. If she had used her real name, the police would have disposed of the evidence immediately. Of course Abra agreed to help her friend. Since there was no physical evidence with the police, Abra would have to call the court on Monday, where Kenny's case was heard. Betty was immensely grateful to her friend. As promised, Abra made the call on Monday. Unfortunately, the physical evidence had been destroyed in April 1993, 10 years later. It was a standard practice. Betty refuses to believe in failure, as she had done so much. All day she and Abra called the laboratory, hoping that some samples had accidentally been preserved. Alas, it gave them nothing. Today, Abra joined Betty and her sons for dinner. The boys immediately noticed their mother's nervous state. Abra advised her to tell them the truth, as they had a right to know. Betty still hadn't admitted defeat, believing that the evidence was somewhere out there. Perhaps that was true. But if so, Betty needed to be prepared for the possibility that Kenny's DNA and the perpetrator's DNA might match. When Abra said that, Betty told her to get out. Everything in this town reminded Betty of her brother. If she gave up, everything would be over for him. Betty personally went to the police station, and once again using the alias Abra Rice, asked them to search for the evidence because it was no longer in the lab. However, Lieutenant Daniels, who was familiar with Kenny, recognized Betty. He was astonished to learn that Betty had studied law just to become Kenny's lawyer. Lieutenant Daniel wanted to help her and took her to the place where old evidence was stored. Unfortunately, there hadn't been any DNA samples here for a long time. Despite everything, Lieutenant Daniel still considered Kenny a good guy, although Officer Nancy Taylor had never shared his opinion. Learning that Nancy Taylor had been retired after an unpleasant incident, Betty became interested and came to work at Nancy's place, asking why she no longer worked in the police. Nancy claimed that she had resigned after getting married. Betty knew it was a lie. In reality, Nancy had been fired after attempting to frame a colleague. Of course, Nancy denied it all. Betty doesn't know what to do now. She spent nearly 20 years trying to prove her brother's innocence, but it might have all been in vain. Late in the evening, Betty went to Abra to apologize. However, Abra wasn't angry with her, and upon learning about Nancy's deception, she suggested trying something else. The women went to the laboratory together and asked the employee to search for the evidence once more. Initially, the employee was reluctant to help, but after hearing Betty's story, she felt sympathetic. Perhaps there had been a mistake, and the evidence hadn't been destroyed. This was the miracle Betty had been hoping for all these years. The wait was unbearable for Betty. A couple of hours passed, but it felt like an eternity. Betty couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the box labeled Waters. A completely unfamiliar person had helped Betty selflessly. Finding a DNA sample from the perpetrator in the box, Betty couldn't hold back her tears. The employee promised to fill out the motion for case review herself and send it to the court. Betty was extremely anxious because her brother's life depended on this box. She insisted that the box be sealed with tape. After leaving the laboratory, the women embraced. All their efforts had not been in vain. Meanwhile, Kenny spent his days in prison. Soon Betty received a call from Barry Scheck, who was astonished to learn that she had not only become a lawyer for her brother but had also obtained the evidence. The process might take several months. Prosecutors don't like admitting their mistakes, so the trial would be challenging. When Betty met with her brother, she was surprised when he refused to take the DNA test. Kenny was sure the test would come back positive because the cops would find a way to frame him again. Barely containing her anger, Betty told her brother that he would do it, or she would personally deal with him. Days turned into a continuous stress. Talking on the phone with Barry Scheck, Betty asked why the DNA test results were still not ready. The lawyer said that the prosecutor was doing everything to hinder it. Betty was on the verge of a breakdown, and only Abra's support kept her from going crazy. Betty personally went to the laboratory to find out why the DNA analysis was still not ready. Betty was sure that the prosecutor would do everything to keep Kenny in prison. The laboratory supervisor refused to talk to her. Betty was about to spend the weekend with her sons when suddenly one of the boys noticed a piece of paper in the printer. Finally, the DNA test result was ready, showing that Kenny was innocent. The mother and sons hugged for a long time. Everything Betty had been through had not been in vain. Now Kenny would get his freedom. At the first opportunity, Betty met with her brother and showed him the paper. He couldn't hold back his tears. No one believed it, but Betty had achieved it. Kenny asked the sister for one more favor. He wanted her to call his daughter Mandy and tell her that her father was innocent. Of course, Betty fulfilled the request and left a voicemail. However, Kenny's ex-wife deleted it. It seemed like the worst was behind them, but it wasn't. Soon Betty received a call from Barry Scheck, who said there was a problem. Upon hearing this, Betty began throwing furniture in frustration. It turned out that the prosecutor had decided that there was enough evidence to convict Kenny as an accomplice. Both Betty and Kenny were shattered by this news. Kenny said he couldn't take it anymore. It was too unfair, as he was innocent. But Betty wasn't about to give up. Barry was on their side, and that meant they had a chance to win in court. However, Kenny didn't believe it and was convinced he would remain in prison forever. In a fit of desperation, Kenny started behaving disruptively, so the guards had to handcuff him. Betty had become a local legend, but she wasn't proud of it because her brother was still not free. However, Barry wanted to turn the situation in their favor, as the DNA test had not only proved Kenny's innocence but also that the witnesses had lied. Betty, Barry, and Abra visited Kenny's ex-girlfriend Rosanna Perry, who had testified against him in court. According to Rosanna, Nancy Taylor, who wanted to put Kenny behind bars, had threatened her. The officer told Rosanna that if she didn't testify against Kenny, she would be considered an accomplice. In the end, Rosanna couldn't withstand the pressure. As before, the woman leads an immoral lifestyle. When Betty asked Rosanna if she was willing to sign an official recantation of her previous testimony, she refused. She didn't want to go to jail for perjury. After this failed attempt, Betty went to see Kenny's ex-wife. Mandy, Betty's niece whom she hadn't seen in years, opened the door. It turned out that Mandy hadn't received any message. The father sent her letters every week, but Brenda hadn't given it to her daughter. Without listening to her aunt, Mandy slammed the door. It was New Year's Eve. The sons no longer resent the mother, who gave up everything for her brother. She only wanted justice to prevail for her loved one, and that was admirable. Betty with her sons visited Mandy, making another attempt to talk. But Mandy didn't want to know the father's relatives, as everyone considered him a criminal. On New Year's Eve, Betty visited the brother. This holiday was filled with sadness for her. Perhaps justice would never prevail. Soon Betty went to the snack bar where Mandy worked. Reluctantly, the girl agreed to talk to her aunt. Betty explained the situation. So Brenda slandered her husband, which led to his conviction. DNA test confirmed Kenny's innocence, but that wasn't enough for the prosecutor. Now they want Brenda's testimony. Betty gave Mandy a gift from her father. He had made this box for her himself. Inside was their joint photograph that had hung in Kenny's cell all these years. Betty, Barry, Abra and Mandy went to Brenda's house. She admitted that after the breakup with Kenny, she started dating a guy named Robert. He said that they could get money from the cops by providing false testimony against Kenny. Robert went to Nancy Taylor, who chased him away, and then she arrested Brenda and threatened to take her daughter away. Brenda had no choice but to comply. Eventually, Brenda agreed to officially recant her previous testimony and signed the document. After this, Betty immediately contacted the prosecutor, informing that Brenda Marsh had confessed to perjury. Therefore, Kenny was innocent. Betty had finally achieved her goal, but it wouldn't have been possible without the support of her loyal friends. Kenny prepared for his final hearing. Soon the trial took place, which ruled that Kenny was innocent. He was uncuffed and released. It felt like it wasn't real. The brother and sister embraced each other. Only love and mutual support had kept them from breaking. Dozens of reporters were waiting for them outside the courthouse. This story had caused a real sensation. In his interviews, Kenny talked about how he had lost 18 years of his life. Betty, on the other hand, announced that she probably wouldn't continue her legal practice. It wasn't what she wanted to do in the future. For the first time, Kenny met his grown-up daughter. They had a lot to say to each other. Watching them, Betty was truly happy. Finally, the family was reunited. Just like in their childhood, the brother and sister sat by the lake. Kenny said that these nearly 20 years of waiting were worth it because he knew his sister had fought for him. Then the voiceover tells us about the real characters of this story. In 2009, Kenny Waters was declared innocent. Nancy Taylor was not held accountable because the statute of limitations for the crime had expired. Betty continued to work in the Innocence Project to prevent